Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series hosted by the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. We would first like to acknowledge and to honor the Mi'kmaq, Lenape, Bode'wamik, and Sawanwa people as past, present, and future caretakers of the lands on which Indiana University Bloomington is located. These ancestral Indigenous homelands and resources are the current home of the Environmental Resilience Institute. We encourage everyone to engage with contemporary communities, to learn the histories of this land, to look at who has and who does not have access to its resources, and to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations within this process of reparative work. Our webinar today will focus on how to integrate equity considerations into local efforts to reduce the risks and adverse impacts of climate change. All webinar attendees are muted. Please enter your questions into the chat function, which you can access by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. In the last few minutes of the webinar, we will share a feedback survey through a Zoom poll. We are also recording today's webinar, and I will share a link to that recording along with follow-up resources with all registrants early next week so that you can share what you've learned today with your colleagues. And now I'm very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Matt Flaherty, who is our implementation manager here at ERI.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us today. At the heart of today's topic, working on environmental change and social equity, is the need for an inclusive and fair approach, one that ensures that policies and programs do not perpetuate or worsen existing disparities, and one that recognizes how these disparities demand a contextual and differentiated approach based on geography, sociodemographic, and health factors, and more. Ensuring that local climate policy efforts are equitable requires intention, well-defined goals and tools or processes to reach them. In line with the Environmental Resilience Institute's commitment to environmental justice, we integrate equity in all of our webinar presentations where possible. But today we're focusing on some of those definitions, examples, and tools to deepen our understanding of a holistic approach to equity in climate planning. We're excited to have Laura Helmke-Long, a PhD candidate at IU's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and Phoebe Romero, the Environmental Program Coordinator for the City of Austin, Texas, Office of Sustainability, to engage with us on this important topic. This webinar series is coordinated by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. And in addition to the webinar series, ERI has many other resources available to local governments and to the public. Today, I wanted to highlight the In This Climate podcast, a collaboration from ERI and the IU Media School. With multiple episodes every month, the podcast aims to imagine and inspire an environmentally just future by amplifying the voices of those most affected by environmental burdens and climate change, and those historically marginalized within the environmental movement. Host Emily Miles puts it all in context, moving past jargon and doom and gloom fatalism, sharing environmental news that you can use. You can see a few examples of recent episodes here. You can also access the podcast not only on our website, but most popular podcast apps. And we wanted to highlight for any of you in the Bloomington area in particular, a special live episode next week, Earth Week, on Friday, April 22nd, I believe, at 9 a.m. And I think Amanda is going to put a link in the chat, if she hasn't already, to the Facebook event for that. So whether you're live and in person or joining us remotely, you could tune into that special episode for Earth Week. We also hope you'll be able to join us for next month's webinar, which will focus on smart growth policies for climate adaptation and resilience. Please feel free to share the event with your friends and colleagues who you think might enjoy this topic focus. We're really excited about the webinar guests who we're in the process of finalizing now. We also want to thank Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, the Association of Indiana Counties, Health by Design, and the Indiana Public Health Association for supporting our webinar series. And thanks again to everyone who is attending today's webinar. You're able to share with friends and colleagues a recording of the webinar if they're unable to join us today. We'll send all registrants a recording and additional resources in the coming weeks. And you can also find all past webinar recordings on our website and on our YouTube channel. So with that, I will share a bit more about our speakers and then turn it over to them. Laura Helmke-Long is a doctoral candidate at the O'Neill School for Public and Environmental Affairs, where she is part of the research team with the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Laboratory and the Energy Justice Lab. She studies climate change and energy policy, environmental health, and environmental and energy justice. In her dissertation titled Equity in Local Government Sustainability Planning, What Drives Cities to Care, Laura examines the factors within the sustainability planning process that correlate with or motivate greater equity considerations in city plans, and explores the drivers behind municipal programs supporting vulnerable communities. Laura has worked for the government in various capacities, including positions with the Chicago Public Schools Magnet School Program, Fort Wayne Community Schools, the EPA's Energy Star program, and as a contractor to the State Department while living in Serbia and Germany. Next, we'll have Phoebe Romero, who currently works as the Environmental Program Coordinator for the City of Austin, Texas, Office of Sustainability, where she focuses on air quality and climate action that reduces environmental impact and improves the quality of life and outcomes for historically impacted communities. She's passionate about the intersection of climate policy and racial equity, and in past roles, she has implemented utility energy efficiency programs for large commercial and institutional organizations across Texas, and has evaluated energy and water conservation initiatives in Huston-Tillotson University. She has a BA in political science and Latin American studies from Brown University and a joint professional science master's in environmental management and sustainable development from St. Edward's University and Catholic University of the West. With that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Laura Helmke-Long.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Well, thank you for asking me to be a part of the seminar today, and I am happy to be here talking with all of you. And thank you for all of those people who are attending in attendance today. I'm joining you from Europe actually right now. So if the sky gets a little darker, I'm 6 hours different from the East Coast right now. So it's good evening on my side of the ocean and good afternoon to you all. But I wanted to introduce myself. I'm a 5th year PhD student, PhD candidate now, hopefully in the last year, working on finalizing the research for my dissertation, where I'm looking at local government city planning processes. And as Matt mentioned, I'm very interested in the intersection of equity and what other factors might contribute to cities incorporating more equity concerns in their planning process. And before coming into the EPA, I worked in the government in multiple roles, but the one that seems most applied and relevant to this was I worked with state and local governments with the Energy Star program, working to get the energy efficiency piece in cities' climate efforts and their just sustainability efforts and in any of their energy programs in order to reduce their bills and use that funding to support more investments in environmentally positive efforts, either through healthier schools, more versatile and green communities, and just getting people to measure their energy, and by measuring, seeing how you can actually reduce very easily in many cases. So that's where I come from, but I became really interested in the intersection of energy efficiency and climate action and the health impacts on communities. And since then, I have been studying the health side and the well-being of community members as they relate to climate change and other sustainability concerns. So today I was asked to talk about how equality and equity and justice, what these mean and how they relate to our environmental studies and environmental planning. And it's kind of complicated, at least in the academic sphere, because these terms are used a lot interchangeably, even though they're not necessarily the same. And when you look at just the definitions here, social equity refers to the fairness, justice, and equality concerns in their field. So in the very definition of social equity, we have already these notions of justice and equality. Another one, the Standing Panel on Social Equity, it's the fair, just, and equitable management of institutions, concerned about implementing public policy and distributing goods in an equitable and fair way. And again, when we look now at the EPA's definition, equitable development incorporates a need to help affect environmental justice concerns. So again, they're tied very closely together. And when we talk about them, we want to sort of think, well, how are they different? And I think we all have our own ways of understanding this. I have children, and I giving them the equal thing is not always the fair thing, but thinking of where they're coming from and what they need. And so a more equitable approach. And then justice is, like, to me, correcting prior problems where things weren't fairly distributed. And when I was doing a training with the EPA, I am not able to move forward my slide. Hold on. There. Okay. I did a training for the EPA with their Energy Justice Screen, which is a tool I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And I thought this was a really great visual. I couldn't find it exactly on their website, but I saw it then on another, the Mobilize Green. But here it shows how we can think of these three related concepts, but sort of understand the differences. And again, equality might be they're all on the same stool. It's of equal height. But one can easily see over. Another is a little bit strained. She's probably just at eye level, but the younger person can't see it all. They're too short. So then equity would be, and we get this, okay, let's give everybody what they need. And that's then having the tools to sort of match where they need to be at in order to see the soccer game. And then the third way of looking at it is we just remove the barrier entirely and make it so that we don't have to prevent anyone from seeing what is happening, and that the barrier has since been removed. So to me, this is a very easy way to sort of think about it when I'm doing my own research and trying to tease out the differences in the way people are describing their programs and plans. And then just as a practitioner too, thinking about what needs to happen, I think we should think through these things too. Like equality might sound best, but there are certain communities that might need a greater investment because of past injustices. So in order to create a more just community, think about it, who needs what and how do we help get them there? And that's where we're considering equity. Sorry, my screen is slow. Why are you not? So again, I'm an academic, so I'm sorry if this is boring or tedious, some of these definitions, but it's really important to understand who benefits and who is bearing the cost of our programs. And not just that, but thinking who should benefit and who should maybe bear more of the cost. I think right now we're thinking more in a US context, but with all these decisions, you have another layer of the countries we're thinking about too. And there are big concerns also with climate justice and energy justice, comparing the global north and global south. But I think a lot of us at least should begin with thinking about our local communities and who is bearing the benefits and who's bearing the costs. And within these components of thinking of equity and justice, we also have the ideas of not just in outcomes, but in the process. How did the plan get shaped? Was it equitable? Were all voices heard? Could all people participate in the process? Again, so in sort of the public administration literature, they think of social equity as having the procedural fairness, the access equity, quality equity, and outcomes. Those are the components. In the justice literatures, you have sort of similar ideas. They're not exactly one for one, but you think of the distributional concerns. Where are environmental harms located? Where are environmental benefits located? How are these decisions made? Is enforcement equal across communities? And then recognitional justice, which wasn't really talked about in the social equity definition above that. Recognitional is that idea that we understand that past decisions have really shaped the playing field of where people are at and what opportunities they have. And so we have to really think about these past decisions as we think about equity concerns. We can't just look at how things are today, but the reasons for why they might be that way. And then getting into sort of why we want to think about equity when we're talking about climate action or other environmental and energy efforts is that burdens are really borne more by vulnerable and marginalized groups. And so why should a city or why should people interested in climate change at the local level or the state level, federal level, but here I think we are more focused on local governments, is that the local governments in the local setting, they can see the people who are being injured and harmed by the challenges we will be facing with climate change and other energy and environmental concerns. And local governments, also there's a sort of an ethical reason for them to do this, that as a public administrator, we serve, having been a prior public administrator, now a researcher, but you serve the greater good and you really want to help protect your communities, especially vulnerable members in the community from environmental harm. And then just sort of why it's hard to talk about climate change, energy, environment, and all these. I sort of think of sustainability as this wonderfully broad umbrella. And because by definition, sustainability should have the economic, environmental, and equity concerns, that I'm going to just sort of refer to this all as sustainability related planning, because a lot of cities, as I've been doing my studies, their climate action is housed under sustainability. umbrella or plan. Others have a separate climate action plan. Others have a separate energy plan. But so it can be found in a number of places. But if you don't mind and aren't offended, I'm going to just sort of say the sustainability related research that I'm doing in sustainability related plans. And that is covering the different places where we can talk about equity concerns. So when you're studying, and what I have found is that, and prior studies have found this too, is that equity is unevenly addressed in city plans. It's a number of different types of planning efforts, as I was saying. So you have to really cast a wide net. You might say, oh, the city's doing nothing, but then you might see in their comprehensive plan, they actually have an area on energy and equity or on climate action and equity. So you need to look at comprehensive plans and strategic plans. But in all of those plans, it's not very frequent that you find equity, unlike environmental or equity concerns, which are addressed more often than the equity concerns have been. Distributional equity concerns have been found to be emphasized over procedural equity. And so again, that's talking about where the benefits or harms might be located, like where are the parks being placed, or who's paying this, where are the taxes going, or who's going to have higher energy costs. Those would be the distribution of the benefits and harms, versus the procedural is looking at who was at the table when these decisions were made. But they have found when there are greater public participation efforts in a planning process, there are usually more equity considerations in plans. And that's an area of research I'm really interested in, seeing how that relationship, when the public engages with the decision makers, how they can express their concerns and how that might make people's and cities' plans more equitable overall. So that's, I'll get into my own research a little bit later. But what other research has found is that ideally, or this is more just theoretical, ideally a public participation process would include those who are vulnerable and marginalized, because it can help support having procedural equity goals in your plan. And that there is a positive relationship between public participation and sustainability actions, and that but there are costs and benefits to both the public and to the administrator. So it needs to be done well and with thought. And so just aspiring to have some procedural equity in your planning process is not enough. You need to really think of how you might be burdening people, or how you can make those burdens less so. I have seen some cities have started to do sort of public feedback sessions in grocery stores across the city. They have worked to put the materials in other languages. They hold it at different times of day. Some have even provided some babysitting services. So those are things you can do to help improve getting people that you might not typically get in a participation process, where the community can be really involved in the sustainability related planning efforts. But again, some individuals who are vulnerable have more burdens than others, and it might be asking them a lot, then also be responsible to give voice to their concerns. So we want to make sure that they're not overly burdened in that way. Why should we be concerned about equity and climate change? Because it is going to be a very traumatic event for many people as the heat rises. We've already been seeing this with increased hot days in the summer and heat-related deaths. Not only the heat itself, but it increases the amount of pollutants in the air and can lead to increased respiratory illnesses. You have to especially pay attention to especially older individuals that may not be able to get out, or people in older homes that lack air conditioning. And then there's the double-edged sword. Not only is the heat rising, but with our changing energy platform, which is a wonderful needed thing to reduce our carbon emissions, there are increased energy costs. So people are experiencing higher energy bills at the same time that heat is rising, or colder winters. And we have to really be concerned about disconnections of people's electricity and their other utilities, so that people aren't faced with extreme cold or extreme heat. So this is sort of the energy justice literature, which links to the climate change justice literature as well. In addition to the extreme weather events, of course, there is a chance for more forest fires and storms and tornadoes, and these things affect everyone. But again, you have to be cautious of who might be having the information about what is about to happen, how you can get people removed from their hazards. And so again, paying attention to vulnerable communities in your city is very important. So how can you incorporate equity into your plans. And I'm sure many of you are doing this, and this might be just a review for you. You already know all these tools, but for those that don't, and I know that some other speakers have actually brought in some of these tools, so it definitely, for those of you who've attended this a lot, I know my advisor, Aaron DeLotte, talked about the Social Vulnerability Index and the Hoosier Resilience Index, but those are two tools that sort of look at how different demographic factors, linguistic factors, access to transportation, and so you can identify those communities that might face more struggles related to natural disasters or increased heat, and you can identify and where you might need to intervene and where you should address your plans to have some maybe extra support. In addition to the Social Vulnerability Index and the Hoosier Resilience Index, there's the EJ Screen tool that the EPA has put out, which helps you to see where different environmental harms are located in your communities. Again, another useful piece of information in your planning. And then the Low Income Energy Affordability Data tool, the LEAD tool, put out by the US Department of Energy, helps people see where across their communities some people might be facing higher energy burdens based on average energy costs for that area and the housing stock in those communities. I'll go through each of these pretty quickly, but just to give you an idea. But the Social Vulnerability Index can be seen via counties. The latest set of data is from 2018, and it uses data from the census to build up different sort of factors based on either an overall factor or on housing, language, socioeconomics. So here's nationwide. I know we're not all just Indiana folks in the call today. So for anyone, you can go in and look at this, but you can also then go in and get specifics for your county. This is Monroe County, where Bloomington, Indiana University is located. And so here you can see the different components of the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. The one on the left is sort of the composite score that factors in these 4 different themes, or you can break it down by the socioeconomic status, the household composition, the race, ethnicity, and language, or their housing type and transportation. So you can see that some areas might, as a composite score, are more vulnerable, but then when you break it down, if you're concerned maybe more about transportation, you can see, oh, actually there's another area that is really lacking access to transportation, and we should put our investments for better bike paths or more bus stops in that community. For those of you who live in Indiana, the Environmental Resilience Institute has put together this fabulous tool that is sort of, it's based on the Social Vulnerability Index, that's there, but it's also combined with forecasting for increased heat events and increased precipitation events in the state. So you can plug in your city here. I have chosen, in this little yellow space is Allen County, Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I grew up. I was looking at that. So you can see below that, you see the different breakdown of the Social Vulnerability Index. And this is comparing within the state of Indiana, not comparing nationwide. And then you can sort of see also how the different counties will be affected by the different scenarios related to rising heat or increased precipitation. So this is a very useful tool for any of the planners, any of the people interested in what's going on in Indiana. And maybe others, if you don't have something similar in your own state, could model a sort of tool that you create yourself to identify where vulnerabilities may be. The EPA's EJ Screen tool is available for any state, any city. Again, I plugged Fort Wayne in here just to give you an example. They have a composite score, the EJ Index, which sort of combines the environmental harms with the intersection of low-income populations and people of color with the environmental indicators I'm looking at. So this one I had clicked on the Superfund proximity. And so you can see which areas have a higher percentage near a Superfund site that also might be more vulnerable. And you can do it for a number of different indicators. But again, these are all useful tools to help people think through where you might want to intervene in order to make your plans more equitable. Finally, here's another tool that's available. All of these are available for free and fairly easy to use. This one is the one about energy burdens, and it's across the nation. You can pick any state to look at, or you can then also dive in at a certain area. And I was looking at the census tracts in Indiana here, and you can choose the filter you want. I chose to see those who are at the below or at the poverty line. So here you can see for those who might be most vulnerable, what % of their income they're spending on utilities, on their energy bill. So this can help if you're focusing more on energy burdens or energy justice issues. You can look at these tools. So all of these tools, none of them solve the equity concerns, but they can help us all think where we can address and intervene. And in my research, I found that not many communities are using measures like this to find where vulnerable communities may be. Something I didn't put on there because it's not a nifty tool, but I've seen that some cities have created maps of the tree coverage in their communities, and they are investing trees in those neighborhoods that lack it, mapping it with sort of the heat island effect to help reduce some of the energy burden. So what these tools can help with, and I'm just showing here this framework that I have used in my own research, is the vulnerability framework, which can be thought of as having sort of 3 different components that affect the vulnerability of communities. And that is what someone's exposed to, the sensitivity of that person to that, and then their ability to adapt to it. So for example, higher energy costs is an exposure, and the sensitivity is a terrible housing condition or, low income household. Those people are where you should maybe invest to help that adaptive capacity piece, which can balance out some of that exposure and sensitivity to reduce the overall vulnerability. So in planning, the point I wanted to make sort of in my spiel here is that it's really important to realize that not everyone is going to face the same harms from climate change, and the burdens that those who are most vulnerable have are going to be much greater than those who may have more economic means to, keep their thermostat running or go away for a vacation or visit a pool. So we want to make sure how can we address the needs of everyone in the community. And although it's wonderful to provide resources for the whole community, think of how you can also maybe set aside some funds that specifically target those in greatest need. So in my research, I'm looking at plans. I'm not looking at yet the outcomes of these plans, especially since a lot of equity considerations are just sort of starting in the last 10 years as I see the plans that are newer and newer in time, they seem to have more equity parentness, as I and my team members call it. So we're kind of looking at plans to see, is a plan explicitly stating a concern about equity? Some plans say we want to protect everyone. And that's sort of an implicit equity that everybody should have something. But if you explicitly call out an equity concern and how you define it. And so I think, as someone I'm not an expert on plans, but as someone now reading and consuming a lot of city plans, it's really great when someone can explain what they mean by equity and what they mean by justice, especially given the earlier slides that say that, these really are interconnected ideas, and to sort of stress what you mean and what your community means when you talk about it. And then the next step is really like, are there things you are saying that I can do to help improve the equity situation or make our community's planning process more equitable? And what in the plan, am I saying, we're going to do this, and here's how we're going to fund it, and here's how we can track it. Those are great things that we're not seeing in a lot of plans. A lot of people are mentioning it, but we're not seeing like how you get there. I'm really excited to hear Austin's talk, because I know they have a really great plan. And then finally, just sort of to wrap it up with me, what I'm looking at is how that public participation piece can improve equity considerations in cities planning. And again, I didn't have the time to get in more deeply, but you do have to be aware that there is the potential for harms. There can be distrust on both sides, that if the planning process doesn't go well. So although I've seen a call for greater public participation, incorporating a wider swath of people from the community, we really need to be careful what they get out of it, what the planners, what the public gets out of it, how trust can be encouraged and supported, or how it might be eroded. And you really, if somebody is taking the time to give their feedback to the city, if it's not seen or used or explained why those suggestions aren't incorporated, that may not be a good sign and a good relationship between the public and the city. So there's a lot to think about, and we're only starting to research this. And so I'm really excited as I spend the next year delving into more depth on that. And hopefully there'll be some useful information coming out of academia to help practitioners in this way. So thank you for your time. Let me know if you have any questions. I just although this isn't climate action, I just thought this was a good image of just sort of the areas where you can think about equity concerns. This is put out by ACEEE and specific to a just energy transition, but I think it applies to all of your planning, you know, thinking about the past circumstances, how you can make your process more inclusive, you know, who's going to benefit, where are the costs going to be, and then actually think about what, not just today, how is this going to benefit future generations. So thank you. And I hope we all continue to keep doing good work.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. And now we'll turn it over to Phoebe Romero.
Thank you, Laura, that was great. And I feel like this is a really good segue into some of the groundwork that you set up. So can everybody see my screen now fully shared? Okay, great. All right, so I'm Phoebe Romero, and I work with the Office of Sustainability. I work on two main plans, and one of them is the Austin Climate Equity Plan, which is our plan to reach net zero by 2040. It is focused on climate mitigation strategies, so really reducing our emissions. And then I also work on our regional air quality plan, which is really focused on what the city of Austin can do to reduce its air quality. So really criteria of pollutant impact. So today I'll be talking about the process for this plan. It's a plan that really took us over 2 years to get approved by council. It was approved by council in September of 2021. So I want to start off talking about our city's definition of equity. So it is the Austin Climate Equity Plan. Our previous plan was called the Austin Community Climate Plan. So part of the process throughout the 2 years of revising it was really knowing and understanding that we had to rename it to really encompass the process that we went through. So in the city of Austin, we really focus on racial equity. The city of Austin has an equity office that was started in 2016, and they follow the framework of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And so racial equity is achieved here when race no longer predicts quality of life outcomes in the community. So we do lead with race, and that is because all of the data shows us that that is the most common indicator of asthma rates, whether you're talking about health, income, and other, metrics. Race is the most common outside of, including more so than income, for example. And so our commitment to racial equity is really rooted in recognizing that we do not have a system that operates in the same way for everybody. And so we want to look at the disproportionality and address it in reference to everything that a climate plan would require. So really thinking about, the transition from fossil fuels, and our new plan actually also incorporated natural systems and thought about carbon sequestration, and then thought about consumption. So we're in the process of putting together a consumption emissions inventory that looks at scope 3 emissions from the city of Austin. And so in the middle here, we have the intersection. These are our 7 equity themes that we put together in what we called our equity tool. I'll go over that in more detail, but all of these themes reflected the concerns and the, I think, central aspects of how equity and climate change are tied. And so I'll go over defining them a little bit more closely later, but we did want to recognize that if we're not proactively addressing equity in our plan, we're perpetuating injustice. And so if we don't lead with equity, then we're continuing the process of inequity that have occurred for a long time in our city. So I'll start off with community involvement. We did have, so again, to this public participation theme that Laura touched on, we had a steering committee that focused on the big picture aspect of our plans. That was basically a mix of city staff and of community organizations. Then we also had advisory groups for each of those plan sections. Typically, advisory groups were called like technical advisory groups, and we removed the technical part because we wanted to make sure that we were ensuring people that were community organizers and maybe that weren't technical experts that their expertise was needed and their perspectives were needed. So, you know, if we're talking about buildings, for example, which is the section that I really was the staff lead for, we didn't just want engineers and architects. We did have them in the room, but we also wanted to work with local nonprofits and with, you know, our local urban league, for example, that focus on like repair programs. And that mix ended up being really important for the way that this plan was written. And then we also had a brand new program called the Community Climate Ambassadors. And that was really rooted in reaching out to communities that had been historically underrepresented and excluded from city processes. That model was rather than saying, okay, we're going to meet, you know, for 2 hours every 2 weeks during the workday. This really allowed a lot of flexibility to meet communities where they were. And so this is just a, you know, a picture of who was in our steering community. So we did have, you know, school districts and universities and like Sierra Club, which is, you know, a big green organization. But we also had organizations that worked on social justice issues, environmental justice issues like Poder, which is a local environmental justice organization. ECHO works on issues of homelessness. And so really wanted to have different voices at the table. So these are community climate ambassadors. They were selected based on their ability to apply an equity lens to this and contribute their lived experience. And so each of these ambassadors hosted a series of conversations with their respective communities. And we basically gave them an interview template, gave them some probing questions. And from there, they you know, either had conversations in groups or even had the ability to do one-on-one conversations. And then our community engagement specialist, who's also pictured here, actually coded all of that and put it together with a series of feedbacks about priorities that we heard from the community. A really important aspect of this is that they were compensated for their time. The ambassadors got $1,500, and we tried to do the math to where they got paid around $20 an hour for all of this work. And again, we had meetings with them on weekends. We had separate you know, options. Our community engagement specialists really tried to meet them where their schedules were. And again, to providing children's activities. The city, you know, doesn't provide childcare per se, but we provide supervised children's activities. That's the terminology we have to use, which is a very important part of this engagement work as well. So again, I mentioned that our engagement specialists coded a lot of these interviews. And so these were the main themes that we pulled together as priorities and concerns. And so I mentioned that the climate equity plan is a mitigation plan. So it really doesn't focus on adaptation and climate resilience. Yet what we heard when people were concerned about climate change, it was really about the impacts of not, you know, reducing our emissions and the impacts that we're already seeing of climate change. And so climate resilience was a large theme here, despite it being a mitigation plan. And then all of the things that people are directly impacted by, like, you know, traffic and air pollution, water pollution, access to healthy food, housing and affordability. Again, you know, when we thought about these themes, we really aligned them back to that equity tool that we developed. And really one of the key things that we had as a takeaway is that, like, anti-displacement is always going to be forefront in impacted communities, right? They're thinking about all of these intersecting issues. And one of the challenges, I think, when we're putting together a climate plan is that, like, I'm in the Office of Sustainability. We're about 15 people. We don't have all the power to make budget decisions. We don't, the housing department focuses on affordable housing, and by nature, cities are siloed. And so when we're trying to make decisions and we're trying to put this stuff together, just know that community is going to see you as the city. And so you can say, no, well, that's not me. I'm the Office of Sustainability. No, you're the city. And so it's really important, I think, to have I've seen it referred to as a power mapping analysis, where you let them know who's, you know, in charge of certain decisions, what the limitations are. I think people appreciate it when you're honest and you say, we don't have all the power to make these decisions, but we want to do this the right way. And, you know, we're going to try our best, but these are our limitations. And I think being upfront about that is good for building trust. And And so again, these are the high level themes that we saw coming forward from our ambassador work. We did have an equity training for all of our participants. One of the things that we started off with as part of that equity training, we didn't lead that ourselves. We hired a consultant, an equity consultant that's local to our area. He focuses on Indigenous rights and has, spent a long time in Austin and has really worked with environmental justice organizations. And something to understand about, I think a lot of cities in the US, if not all major cities, is that redlining was a process that very explicitly, forced residents of color, mainly Black residents, into specific areas of town. And so in Austin, it was written in to basically remove all of the vibrant Black communities that were located throughout the Austin area, and they were placed in East Austin. And so East Austin actually is divided by a major highway. And so a lot of the areas that were on the east side of that major highway were then in a later plan designated as industrial zones. And so we had tank farms, power plants, landfills, all of these located in residential neighborhoods that were occupied by Black communities, and through a lot of less direct, but still, whites only signage, things of that nature. Latinx communities were also had to relocate to those areas as well. And so there's a lot of rich history of environmental justice, and all of these, the tank farm was relocated, the Holly power plant was eventually closed due to a lot of activism. And now a lot of these organizations are also focused on gentrification and displacement. So these very areas that were formerly designated as industrial that have now been, for lack of a better term, beautified, right? And now those areas are actually being, the housing prices are starting to go up a lot, property taxes go up, and then the communities that formerly had, lived there for generations are no longer able to afford those areas. And so we see a lot of sprawl happening and a lot of displacement into the outskirts, right? And when we're thinking about equity and when we're thinking about transportation emissions, right, those two things are connected. Another thing we talked about was white supremacy culture. And if you all are not familiar with that, it's a really great framework that just makes you think about some of the ways in which kind of mainstream organizational culture in the US operates. It is really about either or thinking. So we try to move away from either or, like, oh, we're either going to focus on equity or we're either going to focus on climate, and trying to say we're focusing on both. And that's okay. That's it. Two big problems can be solved together and should be solved together. As a government entity, how are we prioritizing the way that our knowledge and our credentials are recognized versus like lived experience and things like that. And so I encourage everybody to look into this. Right to comfort, having uncomfortable conversations is a part of this process. So all of these things are really important to think about. I did mention our equity tool. So we followed the Government Alliance on Race and Equity as part of our process, and we adapted their process. Basically, when we were getting into our planning process, we had to learn about the history of our place. That was done through our equity training. We collected a lot of data. So Laura went through some really great tools, EJ Screen, Lead Tool. We looked at all of those. In Austin, it's very east-west. The west side of Austin has a lot of canopy cover, and it's where a lot of our wealth is concentrated. The east side of Austin had, a lot of industrial activity, urban heat island, and then we see all of this, poverty and inequitable health outcomes in that area. So that's what a lot of the maps show us. And then when we were actually putting our goals together, we wanted to make sure that, if we were putting an emissions goal, we also incorporated an equity aspect to that. So, canopy cover, 50% canopy cover by 2030, or I'm sorry, I think that one's by 2040. Then that would be coupled with an equitable distribution of canopy cover. So, thinking about writing an equity component. It was a very iterative process. So really thinking about rewriting it, going through our equity tool, and then we're still in step 6. We're still trying to figure out how we can have a public, a transparent process to communicate how we're implementing the climate plan. I mentioned this was approved in September, so there's ongoing work. And we have to, we have a lot of because we had such an engaged group during our planning process, ensuring that we're maintaining those relationships and implementation, I think, is a really difficult part. It's much more difficult than your planning process. I'm learning a lot. We're going through a lot of conversations on how to best do that. These are our themes. So, how do these strategies help health outcomes? How do they, help with affordability, accessibility, just transitions, really thinking about that green jobs piece? How do they help community capacity? Cultural preservation is a big one because of it's, directly tied to gentrification. So if we're building beautiful, net zero green buildings, and they, are completely demolishing, let's say, local history, specifically the history of our Black and Brown communities, then they're not going to be received in a way that we would want. So, and so we have to think about that historic preservation as well. And then lastly, accountability, and that's holding ourselves accountable, and then also holding other institutions that aren't governmental institutions accountable, right? That's a big other issue that we're thinking about, big businesses. How do we, influence that? It's very difficult. This is what the actual tool looked like, and I'm happy to share that. We created this tool with lots of inspiration from other cities, and basically, took out what cities like San Antonio and Boston and Providence and Portland and Seattle had done, and kind of created our own version of it with community, had a lot of community input into this. And so basically, when we were putting the strategies together, we asked these questions in a group and tried to come up with whether it was harmful, neutral, or beneficial. If it was harmful, we had to think about, well, how can we implement this strategy in a way that would mitigate that harm? When you do this type of exercise, it's not to come up with an absolute answer of what's absolutely going to happen, because we don't know, we can't predict the future. It's really about thinking through how you can have more equitable implementation. And it's the discussion and the thought process that I think makes it different from what has been done before, right? Because oftentimes we have unintended consequences, and that's because we never thought about what the harm could be. So in the end, our plan is 17 goals and 75 strategies. Again, touching back on prioritizing incentives and communications and outreach in communities of color, and thinking about anti-displacement and jobs and health and all of the other benefits. And we need to continue to do that as we're implementing the plan. And so that's it. That's my contact information. And I know there's going to be a follow-up email, so I can share these slides. And we do have a climate plan page, and then a story map that we created that is, kind of goes into some of the community members who helped write the plan and their stories. And yeah. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. And again, Laura, what terrific presentations. I know they're very timely for some of the programming we have going on right now with our local governments partners in the resilience cohort, working on climate action planning, for instance, and really with all our programs as we've tried to build local government capacity for really in-depth community engagement, participation, building trust, and working on equity as a central pillar to climate action and preparedness. So really appreciate all that. And as a reminder for folks, we will share either slides or links to resources that were shared in a follow-up email along with the recording once we have that captioned. And then of course you can always find that online. So with that, I can open it up to questions from folks. Please feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat. Amanda and I will help coordinate those and keep an eye on those, and pose any questions you have for Phoebe or Laura. I can start us off with one or two if we need. And some really great connections across both your presentations and again, the work that we've been doing with local governments. And I think something I wanted to highlight was these different aspects of or ways to think about equity and justice. In particular, I think distributional concerns, who's burdened, who benefits, are maybe the more obvious or traditional way to think about equity. And I think when it's easy to get engaged in this work and think, okay, we've identified folks that are exposed at a higher level, and we're going to fix that by doing X. And then bringing that to your mention of paternalism and other aspects of white supremacy culture, Phoebe, that undermine our ultimate purpose, even though it's well-intentioned, because it's not engaged with community in a real procedurally just and equitable fashion. So that working on those next steps to build trust with communities, meaningfully engage folks to help co-develop solutions, to understand circumstances as expressed by folks with lived experience, is very different than identifying, simply the data or statistics, which are still needed, and implementing plans. So I guess drawing that connection, maybe Phoebe initially, but I'd welcome either of you to share thoughts about your either experience or what you're seeing, maybe challenges and advice for how to take that next step for local governments who are thinking about distributional disparities and issues, want to address them, but maybe don't have strong relationships with all the communities they need. We identified some specific strategies that I think are really, really great, but maybe highlighting how you've overcome barriers in that space and tips for local government practitioners.
Yes. And I see some questions coming into the chat that I think can be pulled into my answer about challenges and keeping people engaged. So we, during the planning process, so we had nearly 200 people involved overall when so each advisory group was probably like, up to 30 people. Then we had our ambassadors, that was 12 people. And so we say nearly 200 because, when we added everybody together with the advisory groups, steering committee, and the ambassadors, it was a lot of community input. I think a challenge now is we, in the planning process, it's very easy to say, your task is to help us write these goals and strategies, to give us feedback on that. With implementation, now we're talking about, new programs, we're talking about changing programs, we're talking about efforts that several departments have to implement. And then in some cases, we need to work with outside folks to influence, and that's, through ordinances or regulations or incentives and other things. And so I would say that right now we're still trying to figure out, we have a commission called the Joint Sustainability Committee. A lot of cities may have these boards and commissions that are community members. The rules are very strict on those, you meet monthly, and the communicate, there's Robert's Rules of Order. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it can be very difficult to participate because it's the accessibility, right? Again, of that type of system is limited. And so we're trying to figure out what does it look like to have an ongoing community process. We're going to continue the ambassador programs, but we have to redesign it because this time we're not trying to get specific feedback. We're trying to tie in implementation to that. So I'd say that's a challenge. We did do additional public input processes. We have a tool called Speak Up Austin, and we put out surveys. So once we had the plan written out, we were like, here are all the strategies, here's the draft, here's the opportunity for the general public to actually provide feedback. Something that we, that made it really difficult was, when you're opening it up for feedback, the people that are more likely to provide feedback in that type of way are people who may not be most directly impacted. So that's the challenge. But you do have to do both because, I think it's due diligence to be as broad in public engagement as you can. But yes, you have to kind of balance the breadth where you're really trying to reach a specific community that's impacted, and then or the depth rather, versus the breadth of trying to reach as many people as possible. Why it took 2 years, and I'm sorry, I want to let Laura, because I know there was a question for her as well. We did run into, where we are Texas, we did run into the state legislature affecting one of our goals around net zero buildings. And there's a lot going on around banning gas and trying to not allow gas in buildings. And so that's something you can't do in the state of Texas. And we needed to make sure that we were compliant with that process before we released a plan that, said one thing or another.
Thanks. Anything to add as follow-up, Laura?
Not so much on the specifics of how the implementation worked, but I do see there are a few things about sort of two things I kind of want to comment on, and that's the whether there's been a mitigation strategy that's harmed someone. And I think maybe less directly. I mean, when in some of the work I've done through like the new energy system is causing increased energy prices. It's coming down, but still those subtle differences can be a lot. For most people it's maybe not much, but for some it's a big burden. So it's like we are going to have to pay for the energy we are getting that we want to be cleaner, but it might be a higher price for some people, and that really can affect what we have seen disconnections from utilities. So that's one specific thing. If you think of like reducing our fossil fuel burden, we should think about the burden on certain people with higher energy costs. The other thing is sometimes this gets at gentrification. Some cities, as people have been pushed out to the outside the city limits, and then you have like reduced traffic or you have congestion charges, you might be burdening someone who already has like a car that's not a new car. So it's got poor emissions, and then it costs even more to get into the city. So it's things like this. And then also you can think of the side of benefits. You've got all these like EV benefits, but a lot of things like energy efficiency and things that require upfront costs, a lot of people that are lower income aren't able to take advantage of these programs because of that upfront investment, even though over the long term, they might be saving money. So those are some specific things where you can see like that the benefits are accruing more to those who are already well off, and the harms are happening to those that are already more vulnerable. So that's a specific instance. And then someone asked about whether there are ways we've actually sort of monitored some success. And I'd say maybe the things in what I've seen is mostly like with tree coverage, where you can see like parks and trees improving as people think about like the needs. So that's a very physical way you can see, oh yeah, this is improved in this neighborhood used to not have that. And some of the other things, I think the benefits are going to be a little bit longer to see. And we haven't really identified all the metrics of adaptation and resilience and equity. So those are things we're still thinking through. But yeah, so I'd say that the most obvious is like the sort of improved school structures maybe, and improved streets and roads and bike paths, and then the trees. So you can see some of that.
Thank you, Laura. One last question before we go here for Phoebe to kind of dig into the details on that tool you showed with kind of key questions with that -1, 0, 1. When exactly is that framework used? Is it applied to the 75 actions you mentioned when you actually develop a policy around it? Or was it when you chose the action? How does that fit in?
Sure. Yeah. So that was, so I mentioned we have 75 strategies. So we didn't want to fill out the, 75 versions of that document. So we did it per goal. So we looked at the goals, so 17 goals, and we basically put the tool into like a, you could fill it out within a slide deck, or you could fill it out within a Word document, and looked at the strategies holistically and answered each of those questions. This was once the strategies were already somewhat, it's like we had come up with like, okay, we need to, develop a workforce program, for example, for advancing net zero buildings. Okay, so that's your strategy generally. Then the way that we use the tool was we had a section in our climate plan that talked about how we'll get there. And so it was, goal, then a strategy, then how we'll get there. The how we'll get there had a series of bullet points that integrated more of an equitable process. And that was from kind of the discussion in the equity tool.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we will have to wrap up. We're at 1 o'clock. Want to really express my gratitude again to Phoebe and Laura for joining us today. Thanks for attendees for joining and for filling out our end of webinar poll. We really appreciate the feedback from you all to help us shape content that is relevant and useful for you. So thanks again, and please join us next month for our webinar on smart growth and climate resilience.
Thank you, everyone.